I've seen a lot. Amid the celebrity allure of entrepreneurship, many exceptional entrepreneurs remain shadowed. Here, I team up with these hidden talents to unveil their challenges and successes. Dive in with me to unearth entrepreneurial gems, learn from our experiences, and get educated.
Rumi says, as you start to walk in the way appears. And so again, it's you set the intention. The intention is to achieve excellence in all areas of your life. And then the Rumi quote follows. So now that you've set this intention, the path will unfold itself.
When you're walking the path and you're trusting the path, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, it doesn't seem to be like, I'm planting. Nothing seems to be growing, and you're waiting. It's almost like the bamboo tree, right? You plant it and it doesn't, I forget how many days it takes to grow. And then all of a sudden within, a short period of time, it grows feet. I'm curious, is there still that part of you that kind of goes, God, when's this going to happen? Like, I'm trusting that, and I believe in, I've got faith, but geez, it sure would be nice to happen sooner. Do you still go back at all to that?
I'm not waiting for anything to happen, though. That's kind of been my philosophy, in the sense that again, we all have a default state. Just like, whether we spend more time in our head or in our heart, we also have a default state, an emotional state. For some, it could be worrying. For some, it could be gratitude. For some, it could be something else. And for me, the default state used to be motion. I gotta keep moving. Gotta keep doing to move things forward, and I've got goals. I gotta go places. And when I made that shift from that verse in the Bible, seek the kingdom of God, and over time, I think where I am today, my default state is content. And so I'm not waiting for things to happen. That doesn't mean I'm not trying. That doesn't mean I'm not ambitious. But my happiness or my emotional state does not rest on something happening. For me, I believe in this idea of sacred monotony, which is that every single day is the same. And every single day is perfect the way it is. So that's why I like my routine. And so I feel like you're winning every day. Like, so it's not like I'm waiting for something to happen a week from now or 2 weeks from now, or like some goal. That's the difference in being goal-oriented or values-oriented. It's important to have goals, but that's not what to help guide you to stretch your thinking. But I don't feel that angst that things aren't happening, because I feel like every day needs to be designed in a way where it's intentional and perfect from that perspective. The Prophet Muhammad said that when you wake up in the morning, don't expect to see the evening. And when you go to bed at night, don't expect to see the morning. So I live, or aim to live, with that awareness. So I'm not waiting for, honestly speaking, I don't know if I'm going to see my girls tonight. I don't know where I'll be in an hour from now. So when I leave home knowing that I don't know if I'm going to come back. And that may sound crazy or morbid, but it's not that. It's just being really, really aware of everything you do, every conversation you've had. And that's, again, is linked to this other idea of being authentic, because and having that heart, mind, and tongue centered all the time, because that's the only way to show up, especially if it's the last time you're going to show up somewhere, right? So yeah, it's because of that, I guess, awareness of our mortality. There's no angst for waiting for things to happen. You keep doing your best. The question to ask is like, am I doing my best? And if you're content there, then everything else, it doesn't matter, There's a great saying from Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who was the founder of Pakistan. And he said, when I show up with my scheduled meeting with God, I just want him to say, well done, Mr. Jinnah, you tried your best. And that's all we can do.
Yep, I agree. I kind of put it in the respect that, somebody had asked me not even a week ago, what's on my bucket list? And I was like, I don't have anything. I don't have a bucket list anymore. Life is my bucket. And I don't think I actually said that at the time. Actually, it just kind of dawned on me now. It's like, life is my bucket. And, the pursuit is to, at the end of my life, whenever that may be, is, to meet the man that I could have been. And if I am able to look at him and recognize, I know you, I've done what was needed to be done, lived with integrity, lived with values, made lots of mistakes. That's okay. So, I love what you're saying, bro. It's good for people, especially when you own your own business, to be able to have these reflections. It's important because you can lose yourself in the do or the movement that you kind of said earlier. And it can be a dangerous place. And to your point about raising everything 10x, it's like not all that difficult. I'm not saying it's not easy, but it's not all that difficult to be 10x in one thing. But where the beauty comes is in the mastery of all things. And so, your message is phenomenal, buddy. And I'm not surprised.
I hope we all have the the courage and the grace to live up to our words with our actions.
I'm curious, like, when you look at this retreat, like you did, with your clients, what is some of the realizations that, some of the people that were there kind of make while they're there? And I'd be curious, just what content do you guys cover? Like, is there specific content? Is it kind of freewheel or?
So day one, it's all very intentionally designed. A lot of thought goes into it. So day one is on conscious leadership. So Diana Chapman is the teacher from Conscious Leadership Group. And I think it's global now, but Diana is based in the Bay Area. It's Diana Chapman and Jim Dethmer who founded it. It's a great book called The 15 Commitments of Conscious Leadership. And they've got some really amazing frameworks. But the one that really resonates with me and I think is very valuable is this thing called the drama triangle. It's just understanding how all of us have so much drama and why do we have repeated drama, understanding when we are playing victim and being self-aware, when we're being the hero, which is not a good thing, villain. We keep basically cycling through the drama triangle at work, in our personal relationships. So just understanding and how that is playing out in our life and how can we take ownership of that and take radical responsibility. I think it starts with that because it starts with self-awareness of the drama in our life. Day two is parenting. And the philosophy we sort of adopt at home is called hand-in-hand parenting, which is also founded by a wonderful woman called Patty Whiffler in the Bay Area. So she joins us with just understanding parenting tools. It's remarkable how little we know about the wisdom behind parenting. I often say, how our children turn out is a function of how we turn out as parents. And we need education. we need practical wisdom here.
A lot of times we're just going off of what we learned from our parents. So I just want to make sure we capture that. It's hand-in-hand parenting.
Yes.
That's what it's called. And they're from the Bay Area.
Yeah. And even Patty wrote a book called Listen, which is a wonderful recommendation.
For parenting.
Right?
And her name's Patty
Whiffler. I believe it's Wipfler. And then day three is relationships. And that is, again, have we really been taught the art of how to sustain, create a truly wonderful marriage relationship? And Terry Real joins us for that. And he's based in Boston, I believe, but he flies in. And I was trying to find the best family relationship therapist coach in that domain. And Terry jumped at me because of how direct and blunt he is. And I think especially for people in our industry, generally men dominated with grandiose personalities. Terry has an art of dealing with them. And so it really explores how and where our tendencies come from, our inner child, our adaptive child, understanding how to, what are the patterns that are getting in the way of really building a loving relationship, how to nurture a romantic relationship, which I think is super important. Again, I'm married now in our 12th year. I realize you got to invest in this as well. I think all of these things require energy, and what energy are we giving to really nurture that relationship? And then day 4 is communication, and this particular thing called non-violent communication, which is a wonderful book by Marshall Rosenberg. However, we invite Daniel Cohen, who has passed away. Marshall Rosenberg has passed on. So Daniel Cohen is, I think, one of the best teachers in that space, and he joins us to talk about communication. It sounds simple, but the idea behind that is that even words can be violent. And that's usually the case when we actually haven't tapped into our underlying need. Something is not being met. And it's remarkable how smart individuals can be so ignorant when it comes to truly identifying their needs. Someone could say, or I could say to my wife, "You never make time for me," which is a kind of snarky comment. It doesn't draw us closer, it draws us further apart. But the underlying need is, I want to feel connected to you. I want to feel loved and spend time with you. But saying that may sound vulnerable, make me feel needy. There's a chance of rejection. So instead, we'll choose the snarky route. And so how can we be more artful in the communication by really understanding our needs and feelings and how to communicate those, whether at work, with our relationships, with our children, all around us. So those are the 4 sort of big topics that we cover in the 4 days. And then the evenings are very thoughtfully curated through like sort of smaller dinner table conversations where I've selected certain questions for the group to ponder over. So yeah, it's just been a wonderful experience, and we're doing it again next year.
Yeah, nice. Congratulations. You talked about this drama triangle, and you said villain, hero. Is there 3 of them? Is that what there's 3 drama?
There are 2 versions of it, but it's a victim, villain, and hero.
Victim, villain, and hero. Okay.
Yeah. So sometimes we'll be the victim, sometimes we'll be the villain in our own story, why did this happen to me? Victim, I should not have behaved that way. I've, made myself the villain now. Or, I will, don't worry about it. I'll take care of it. We're being the hero, but we're not really helping the situation. We're not helping ourselves. We're creating resentment. So just understanding there's a beautiful, simplest tool that they have, which is taking inventory of where are you? Are you above the line or below the line? And I won't do justice to it, so I won't try to explain it, but that simple tool in itself, is so interesting on a daily basis, on an hourly basis, on a frequent basis. Just take inventory of, are you below the line or above the line? Above the line, you're feeling energized, you're feeling resourceful, you're feeling like you can handle anything. Below the line, you're feeling like your needs are not being met. You're below the line. Let me give you an example. Below the line is when you're sending that fiery email, which you would want to avoid. Above the line, you're taking time to respond with patience, clarity, grace. Below the line is when you're yelling at your children. Above the line is when you're talking to them with, again, patience.
So you're trying to achieve the outcome, but it's in a disempowering way, or meeting your needs in a disempowering way versus, meeting the needs of yours and others in an empowering way above the line. Is that?
Exactly. Something of that along those lines, So each of those are very powerful tools. And it's funny because I was introduced to these tools 6 years ago at a retreat that I was invited to, that I attended. And we all have an idea of who we are and how well we're doing, typically, right? I mean, like, we feel we know, which is just a disillusion, which is just an illusion. And after spending a week with Diana 6 years ago, with Patty 6 years ago, and learning nonviolent communication and some other disciplines, at the end of that retreat 6 years ago, we went around in a circle asking, like, what did you learn? And my biggest realization 6 years ago was that I'm not the Jawad I think I am. I'm not the father. I'm not the son. I'm not the husband, not the friend that I think I am, which means I'm not the Jawad that I know I can be. But I was so grateful for that experience because it gave me the tools I needed to be that person, right? So I thought I was doing great as a father, as a husband, but I realizing in that 1 week with those teachers and with the other sort of peers there, I was like, damn, got a lot of work to do.
There's work to do. But it's cool to have that awareness, right? Because without the awareness, how do you move forward?
And the supportive community, right? The supportive community makes a difference. Having like-minded peers who you can count on, you can share ideas with, seek advice from, who have a similar experience to your own.
I love that you're created your community in this realm of the financial world. I mean, it's very impressive. To be able to get people to kind of sync on that level. I'm curious, how has all this learning that you've experienced, the growth that you've experienced, the journey, the story of your own, how do you integrate that with that? The finance world is a pretty A-type, a personality typically. So curious how that integrates and not only how it integrates with the people, but how you've integrated that whole story, the philosophy that you've shared. Your knowledge of philosophy and poets is unbelievable. How do you relate that into something as, I guess, tangible, probably not the right word, but tangible as the markets?
Because this is not how, again, I'd not planned for any of this. And you just kept walking and making the next right decision that you felt was right. And I think once you start writing from a particular space, and I was hesitant to write on a regular basis, but what got me over the edge was this quote from Rumi which said, words are just a pretext. It's the inner bond that draws one person to another, not words, which kind of relaxed me. I'm like, okay, I'm going to write to my heart and then we'll see where this goes. That's important because when you do that consistently for a number of years, you put a certain level of energy or particular energy out there. What you realize is you connect with other people that have that same energy. It's just almost like you attract what you put out. And so I feel like we've almost like self-selected, for the lack of a better word, self-selected this community. Like, I remember walking the streets of Hong Kong with a client like 6 years ago. And he was telling me, and I was having this conversation with him that was got nothing to do with markets. And he's like, it's so interesting that, most of your conversation with people that you meet are this. I'm like, yeah, I find that so interesting as well. He's like, you realize that's because that's what you are putting out there. That's what you're attracting. I'm like, oh, I didn't realize that. So he made me realize that. I was so clueless about that. It's taken me only now, like literally, Dwayne, like 10 years to really be able to like craft the message, because I do think where we essentially are for is mindful investors. That's what this community is for. It's for mindful investors. Up until 2 weeks ago, I would not have been able to say that to you. But even doing this business for 10 years, it's only now becoming clear to me, if you were to define it, what would it be? It's mindful investors. So it's interesting, and so I feel like people are opting in who already feel those values and are interested in those same topics, because it is the case where a lot of conversations that we'll have are not markets related. That's what we come for. That's the reason why people would join. They want to see return on their investment. But at the same time, we all have a certain appreciation and understanding that it's more than just money. And where do we, find meaning?
And I just thought of this as you were talking, but is there some type of, markets are built out of people, and people are driven by emotion. And, emotion comes from the meanings that we attach. So I'm curious, is there a correlation at all, in what path that you've been traveling, to now it's like, oh, wow, like I didn't realize, like, not to say that you can predict any market, but emotion drives markets. And so I'm curious if there's not to get technical. I'm just kind of as you were talking, it popped into my head.
I think very much so. I would say successful investing is not possible without knowledge of oneself, which is, again, the know thyself concept, right? I would say my job is not to predict the future. It's to see the present clearly, which comes back to this idea of living in the present moment and being aware of what's happening right in front of you. The biggest enemy in life is the ego, I would say. Same thing in markets, right? The ego is what gets in the way to take the losses or, book gains, or, I often say the biggest risk we need to manage is ourself. It's not a position. It's not a stock. It's because ultimately we're the ones buying and selling. It's ourself, which is the ego again in some cases, right? So there's certainly an overlap. Markets and life are very much intertwined for the exact reason that you said. It's filled with human emotion, and we're not rational beings.
Do you mind if just from the listener's perspective, as I told you, I don't show up to any of these interviews with conversations. I had no idea where this was going to go. It was totally not what I thought, we would talk about, especially for the first hour and 30 minutes that it's been, but it's been beautiful. But I'm curious if you can, for the listeners who pretty much every listener is going to have some type of investment in the markets. And some of them are going to struggle with, should they stay in the market? Should they get out of the market? Should they, they're going to have to make, whether somebody's managing their money for them, they're going to have to make some decisions around, money and the management of money or the markets. And I'm just curious, because to me, it was so revealing. It's like, until you really know yourself, I've got some friends. I've got a ton of friends who have all gone out and traded, and I used to trade, and, I didn't lose a ton of money, but I didn't make a ton of money. I don't think I, probably knew myself or gave my time, especially in that realm of expertise, to be able to focus on the decision making that's required and the focus that's required. So I just stopped doing it. But I do know a lot of people who've lost a lot of money trying to do their own trading. And I think as you were saying that, it's like, yeah, I can see how they lost money because they're just not fully knowing themselves in that realm or that area. I don't know, maybe if you could, I don't even know if I articulated a question there. Sorry.
No, you did. And I think what comes to mind is a great book, which I think is called The Money Game by George Goodman, written in the name Adam Smith. And he says, if you don't know who you are, the market is an expensive place to find out. And it comes down to that again, what is your risk tolerance? What are you in it for? What is your time horizon? What is your strong suit? And it takes time to build that, right? Really understand what is it that you're interested in. Like I realized over time that I'm not interested in like bottom up balance sheet analysis of stock picks. I'm much more big picture, macro oriented, thinking about themes and where the world is headed, very directional in my thinking, as opposed to, I don't care what's happening in the world. I just want to know everything about this particular company. That's not who I am. And so I think all of us have different interests and different experiences that kind of work to build a certain set of expectations. And it takes time to really figure that out. But then there's also the personal finance element, which is not what I do. The personal finance element is understanding, how you want to organize your finances to meet your goals. And then, the role I see for myself is to really be your thinking partner, right? If you've got an investment portfolio, it's to really help you think about the risk you're taking and be there to answer any questions that you may have. And I may not have the answers, but I do know someone in the community does. And it's a community of friends. And so if I can help connect to people, I'll do that. And if I don't know the answer, I'll go ask somebody else and they'll have the answer. So I think the role I see for myself is this role of being a trusted advisor a thinking partner. And that's and because the community is so diverse, right? Because we've got, CIOs of sovereign wealth funds, we've got hedge fund CIOs, but then we also have some folks that are just focused on crypto, some folks that are managing an RIA, some folks that are just retired and managing their own money. It's so diverse, and I speak to everybody and make an aim to speak to not everybody, as many people as possible. I haven't spoken to everybody, but a vast majority of the community. And that kind of helps me shape my own thinking, and as well as sort of when those insights gets passed through the written work. But it's interesting how everybody's got their own perspective, time horizon, challenges that they're sort of facing. What are the common questions that keep coming up again and again and again? So yeah, it really comes down to like understanding who you are, what you want to do, and then if you need, and because it's so noisy out there, and you don't know who to trust, and there's so much information, how do you make sense of it all? How do you stay clear-headed at a time when everything is so ideological and so biased, and you can't tell what's right from wrong? I think that's again where the role is to provide that clarity. It's to provide that supportive community for folks where you can share your ideas, you can share your questions, your concerns, seek advice, grow. That's kind of the ethos. Is how can we be more mindful of what we're doing?
So do you have people in your community that are managing their own money, like whether they be high net worth individuals that are retired and either are working closely with an investor, but are kind of directing their own, portfolio?
Yeah, many.
Oh, wow. Okay. I didn't know that. And then, so that's good for the listener to know. And then I guess, as you were kind of just saying, talking about the environment, we're recording this on the day that, there's been a significant heat up of the, Iran, Hamas, Israel conflict. And obviously like Ukraine, Russia, or, if you'd asked me, I never would have thought it would have gone on this long. There's, the polarizing election in the US. Again, I actually don't know what my question is here, but it just seems like, and I know we're always, and I'm not trying to cast it as things are bad. This is the best time to be alive in the world. I really sincerely believe that. There are less people enslaved. There's less people in poverty. There's, this is a beautiful time in the world to be alive. There's more access. There's becoming more access. Technology the future, I believe, is bright, but we have some things going on. And I don't know if you can lend some perspective because that's kind of what you do, I guess. And I'm curious what your take is on, the world stage. Maybe there's probably listeners, if I put myself in the listener's shoes, there's, people in, certain industries that may be worried about, what could happen with an election in the US with tariffs and importing and, technology and where things are going to go.
So those are all topics that you mentioned that we write about. And I think part of the job is to really identify what matters. Because again, we all have limited bandwidth. There's lots going on. What is stuff that we can ignore, and what is stuff that really truly matters? And so we can spend more energy trying to make sense of that. And so I make sure that what I'm writing is actionable and timely, not writing for writing's sake. If something is not a relevant risk in the next 6-12 months, I probably would avoid writing about it. And I think over here, I've got perspectives on all of these topics that you mentioned, right? And I think the role is we'll have a baseline view of what I think may unfold, but then part of the job is also identifying alternatives and really challenging your beliefs. So, the idea is I'm going to come in and be like, hey, have you thought about things this way? Because I feel like initially what I thought was a shortcoming, this bank teller, weird, unconventional background. What I'm realizing today, Dwayne, is that it's a core strength because it helps me view the world differently from the vast majority of Western born and trained analysts. And being more, so I see myself not as a market strategist, I'm just a creative thinker. So I approach things with that sort of creative mindset of like, what is happening that shouldn't be happening? What is not happening that should be happening? How about this? What if this happens? It's just trying to be more creative, stretch the imagination, offer alternative viewpoints to what the consensus may be saying, examine the common sort of fears that may be present. Are we headed for a recession? And we were very confident, in the last 12, 18 months that, America can avoid a recession and inflation will still come down. And there's, strong fundamental analysis that sort of defends that conclusion. So that's always been the approach, to be independent, agnostic, rather than ideological or dogmatic. Because most investment mistakes arise simply because of a dogmatic mindset, insisting I'm right as opposed to just being curious, and just asking a simple question: is it true? Whenever there's a very heavily weighted opinion about a particular outcome, just a question: is it true? Does it have to be this way? So it's much more investigative, much more curious, creative in sort of my approach to things, that I feel is also because I'm allowed by my client and the community to like sort of slow down and be reflective as opposed to reactive, which I think is the modus operandi for most in the industry, is because you gotta just be reactive, and that does not give you the time and the space to think deeply, which I'm grateful that I have the space to do.
The thought that ran through my head, and I try to look at this from the listener's perspective, right? I'm driving in a car and I'm listening to what Jawad has to say about this, and what would be the question that I would be that's kind of my whole philosophy. In like, there's two philosophies. There's that philosophy, because I'm really always thinking about the listener. And then the other is, if we're sitting down, having a coffee, and this isn't an interview. To me, this it's a conversation. We're having a coffee, we're, whatever, drink and a cigar, and, having a chat. And that's kind of how I view these conversations, not as interviews. And so the thought that popped into my head as a listener was, how do you take all the information at a macro level? And I'll just take, I don't know if it's the easiest one. It probably isn't actually, but the US, the election. And how do you guys delineate like all the information, and how would one, as a retailer who's like, they've got business in Canada and they have business in the US, just as an example, and they say, hey, what's the future look like? I mean, and I have my own opinions, but I mean, they're just opinions, and they're really probably not backed by anything other than my own sense of what I feel the psychology of people are and emotion of people. But I'm curious, like, how do you guys kind of look at that, and how would a normal person be able to take that information and ask those questions and be able to, extract a hypothesis or a thought process around that?
I think it's first just important to realize that if you and I were sitting here a couple of years ago, I'm pretty sure we probably would not have guessed that 2 years later, this is what the world looks like. Or 5 years ago, or in the middle of the pandemic, that 4 years later, this is where we'll be. Or 10 years ago, that this will, like, and that's a humbling exercise because it just tells you how difficult it is to predict the future, which is why I insist on staying as close to the present as possible. In terms of the writing and the analysis, I certainly, in terms of the writing and analysis, I certainly finish with very clear hypotheses and recommendations. So if you want to discuss the election, for example, firstly, we did not discussed the election until more recently because I just felt it was irrelevant. Again, that timing matters, right? So now our baseline view is that Democrats would win. And it's a very simple thinking. And the reason Democrats will win is because since the post-World War period, whenever you've had the economy this good and the stock market this good, the incumbent party has always won. And it's difficult for me to see the Democrats give up that advantage. It's possible, but that would be my preferred scenario. But we obviously have to prepare for every scenario, but that would be my preferred scenario. The other interesting observation from this year is that there have been a lot of political surprises. A lot of political surprises. The election in Mexico, the election in India, the election in Japan this week, the EU results, elections in the EU. A lot of political surprises. So when there was this consensus around Trump having a clean sweep in the summer, what we were saying to our clients was that, this has been a year of a lot of political surprises. With elections so far away, like, it's difficult to be convinced that Trump's going to sweep this election. There'll be some surprises ahead. And so even now, I feel like the basis would be Democrats winning. The consensus is emerging to that scenario with a split Congress. But the scenario that I think we need to think about more deeply is that what if the political surprise is that the Democrats actually get a sweep? What does that mean for the direction of the country? What does that mean for the dollar? What does that mean for society? So again, then imagining what that looks like, having conversations and debates and looking through history to guide us and trying to build frameworks around how to present that scenario is kind of how I approach things. And then now, another hot theme these days is, AI. And a lot of people think that we're in the roaring 20s, which is basically this prolonged period of prosperity. My job is to question, is it true? And when I do that, I find more evidence that it's not true. And so that's something that I'm writing about right now. I haven't published yet, but that's something that I'm writing about. So that's kind of the approach. Is it true? And that comes back to that, again, that alignment, right? Like, it's funny because when you start to operate from that alignment yourself, when you become just one version of yourself, it really heightens your spidey sense. When you read something in the press, you can tell that this is BS. It's remarkable how much story and opinion is written as fact. And very obvious biases come clear. Like, you can literally read a news article and you can keep asking, is that true or is that a claim? That's a judgment? That can be, like, you could really like red mark the entire piece and realize that very little is factual in this. So how can we put weight on facts? Create a narrative, but create a narrative around facts and then extrapolate, build on hypotheses, but around facts as opposed to just pure speculation and opinions. So that's kind of the approach, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it makes total sense. And I would really like to just have a quick conversation about AI, but I have another question about what you just said there, which was, about articles and things that are written as fact. So what popped in my head there was like, I have some friends working on a project that is trying to combat disinformation and misinformation on the internet. And I'm curious, if you have an opinion on, how toxic that is, and what effect it has on, everyday citizens about what they're reading and what they may be getting off of, say, ChatGPT, since now that is, the go-to place to get your information all in one bucket. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
So my routine is different in that there was a world and a time where I wanted to consume everything. I wanted to know everything. So I would read everything. I stopped doing that many years ago when I realized I can't know everything. I don't know everything. And it's an impossible sort of task list to complete, which basically means the way I operate now is with very little media consumption. I don't read the Wall Street Journal on a daily basis, or the Financial Times, or the New York Times, or Bloomberg. Like, I don't read news on a daily basis.
Nor do I.
I seek out information as opposed to consume everything now. So if I'm writing something, if I'm thinking about something, I'll go do research on that particular topic, and everything else is like, I'm oblivious to. And if it's important enough, I trust the community will make me aware of it. So I'm comfortable not knowing, right? So I prevent or like sort of steer myself away from the misinformation, the disinformation through these habits, where I trust that if something is important, I'll hear it 3 times. Or if something is important, it'll be flagged to me by somebody I trust within the community. And so I'm okay with that. Because it's only going to get noisier, and there's no point fighting that battle. So I much rather be a curator of what I want to focus on, and then just go out, seek that information, run it through my filter process of understanding and analyzing and fulfilling my research duties, and then writing about it. And then once I'm done with that, then move on to the next thing. So it's more targeted. It allows me to be, again, more thoughtful because I'm not distracted. I believe very strongly in being very careful of what you let in through your ears, your visual senses, your mind, through what you read. So I'm very particular about what I listen to and what I see and what I read, almost like gateways blocking those senses.
Yeah, 100%. Jim Rohn, I think it was, that said, stand guard at the gate of your mind. Be careful what you let in, because it can turn toxic. It can influence you in ways that you hadn't planned on being influenced.
I mean, those words are even truer today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed. AI. I know you haven't written the article yet, but I'm just curious, many people would say that, AI will provide an abundant future for us. And like you said, the Roaring 20s is a good example. And you think maybe potentially otherwise. What are the upsides and downsides to AI, and not just necessarily the technology of AI and the deep learning, but how it affects society and everyday people and roles and jobs? And
so I think the comment about the Roaring 20s being the not so Roaring 20s is more specific to stock market returns, right? So, because I'm thinking about everything from an actionable standpoint in terms of what it means for the market, right? So I think, so the question is, a lot of people would argue that we are in an AI powered bull market, and the S&P 500, for example, will triple by 2030, which is a remarkable decade if that is to be the case. And so my job is to question if that's true or not. And what I was saying earlier was the fact that the more I question it, the more I realize I actually don't think it's true. And I can get into maybe why. But with respect to AI, it's related. I think there's a difference between what it means for the economy and what it means for the market. And I think the market returns may be disappointing. But for the economy, I think it's very, very important. It'll run into certain constraints in terms of implementation with respect to the energy needs that we have in store for us. But I think the real turning point will come after the next election, after the next recession. Meaning, I think AI is not meant to augment workers. It's meant to replace workers. It's not meant to make you more productive. It's meant to allow operators to not hire someone for that particular task. And that's difficult to really, one, it's early to get those applications. I mean, we're only 2 years in. And so we still haven't seen enough use cases in a significant manner that will really cause economic disruption or labor market disruption. And we've just had the experience of the pandemic where a lot of labor hoarding is ongoing because of tight labor supply. But after the next recession, when you've had a series of layoffs, I think that will be the key test for AI, in the sense that you would make a decision, do I need a person for this? Or can I get an AI system to do this work? So we're not going to be dealing with those questions right now because there's too much friction. It's too early in that cycle. We already have someone working for us. We're not going to cut their job without knowing whether this can do the job. There's still innovation happening. But after the next recession, after the layoffs, we will be asking these questions. Do I need to hire this person, or can I just get an AI software to do this? Which basically means that following the next recession, hiring could be slower than what we experienced in past cycles, right? So job growth could be slower. That's an interesting thought experiment of what that could mean, right? So that's one way I think about it. That's one thing. That's one way I think about it.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So it's amazing how your mind works. But I'm curious, how do you distinguish between the economy and the markets? Because I would, the layperson, which I consider myself to be, is I look at those and I kind of see the same.
So the economy is made up of various sectors, and then the stock market is made up of various sectors. But the overlap between the market cap of the equity market and the GDP contribution of the economy are very different. And they've been growing divergent over the last 20, 30 years as more concentration has occurred in the equity market. And even GDP by itself doesn't mean much. What means more is the profits growth, right? So sometimes there's a high correlation between the economic growth and profits, and sometimes there's not. And again, depends on the sector concentration. So the reason they're not always the same is because of the concentration and the index makeup of the stock market is different from the economy. So that's where the difference comes in.
But it's interesting that you say that, because now, when I think about that a little bit more broadly, it's, the markets are, a large percentage of the market is 7 companies. Yes. So if they're going through a, cyclical, event that drives profit down, then markets are going to perform poorly.
And that was the key insight for us during the pandemic. So what people were seeing was the worst unemployment rate since the Great Depression. And what we were pointing to was that this will be the fastest profits recovery we've ever seen. So most people at that time, if you remember, were scratching their heads. Why are stocks rallying when the economy is struggling? This is like May, June, July of 2020. The reason was the profits outlook was very strong because the winners in the equity market were becoming even bigger winners. And so even though you had the worst economy, you had the strongest profits recovery ever. And the market was reflecting that. And then the other component is also the multiple, right? The valuation, which fluctuates based on different cycles and where we are in the cycle. So it's, again, understanding those nuances makes a difference. And I would say where we are right now in the equity market, from a valuation and earnings standpoint, I think we're reaching constraints, which makes it difficult to rise beyond. So for example, a lot of people are comparing ChatGPT to the Netscape moment in 1995, saying that we're in 1995. And then we've got 5 years of a roaring bull market ahead of us. But the more I analyze the 1990s, and that's something we've already published on, but I realize that this is not like the 1990s. We've already had a form of that experience in 2021, the 2017 to 21 period. What we're seeing right now in another article we published is the fact that we're not in 1995, we're actually in 1968. So that part of the job is to just look at historical lessons and understand what would be the best template for where we are today in the cycle, in the markets. And and if this is 1968, not 1995, the outcome is very different. And so for me, it's about being alert to those possibilities and making a case for that.
So when you say people look at us and think that it's 1995, is that the advent of the internet? Is that what you're referring to? And then 68, what's the relevance to 1968?
Let me zoom out a bit, right? So basically every decade there's a theme that captures the zeitgeist, becomes an investment mania. So in the 1970s, for example, it was the breakdown of Bretton Woods. And because of that, we entered this gold bull market. But 1980, gold peaked. And then the 1980s zeitgeist was Japan's taking over the world. So it was Japanese companies buying real estate in New York, Japanese management techniques, Kaizen. Japanese were the villains in American movies. Kids were learning Japanese. But 1989, Japan peaked. The 1990s zeitgeist was the internet. It was long NASDAQ. March 2000, NASDAQ peaked. It's interesting how literally these are like 10-year trends. And then it's like a disaster after that. The zeitgeist of the 2000s was China's entrance into the World Trade Organization in 2001, which meant you want to be long China, long EM, emerging markets basically, and commodities. But 2011 onwards, that was a disaster. The zeitgeist for the last decade was best articulated by Mark Andreessen, the venture capitalist, in a Wall Street Journal article from 2011 titled "Software is Eating the World." That was the zeitgeist. But the last decade was tech and software. And that stopped working in 2021. That was the peak. And the best decision you can make as an investor is to avoid the previous zeitgeist. But it's difficult to dethrone dominant beliefs and behaviors that have worked for you. You build companies, you build careers, your reputation based on a particular trend, and you can't imagine it ending. Which is why up until 2015, 2016, people still thought, commodities and emerging markets are the place to be, even though it was a disaster. People still thought Japan's going to come back in the mid-1990s. It, kept struggling. And so there's hope that with AI now, we're back to the golden age. And so, Jawad, how can you be saying this when tech stocks and S&P 500 are back at all-time highs and above the all-time high? That's where the 1968 template comes to mind. Is because we experienced a kind of a bubble in 2021, which is very similar to the 1960s period, which was back then called the go-go years, which our period was called the YOLO years. The YOLO market is something that was referred to in the pandemic days. And the few forces in the 60s, because again, you were talking about this earlier, right? This idea of human psychology and human emotion. We repeat. On a long enough timeline, history repeats. We make the same mistakes over and over again. So the 60s bull market was very similar to the bull market that we saw between 2015, 2016, 2017, and 2021. But after the market peaked in 1966, you had an 8-month bear market of 25% drawdown, which is just what we saw in 2022. And then you went back up in 1968, by 1968, about 15% higher than 1966. And then you had another 2-year decline of like 30%. And it was a rise in the market that lacked animal spirits. It was also more concentrated. It was a lot more nervousness around the state of the world and whatnot. And it's the same thing here. We've climbed back to the highs, slightly exceeding the highs. But what comes next is not a multi-year bull market. What comes next may be a 2-year bear market where you're down 30%. Because the zeitgeist is over. And if that is the case, then there's a certain scenario that no one is talking about, which is that we may be seeing the highs in the equity market. We may, as of right now, be setting highs in the equity market that may be the highs for the rest of the decade. Because if we peak at these levels, or let's say 5-10% higher from here, and you entertain the idea of a 30% drawdown over 2 years, that's 2027. And then it takes you a couple of years to get out of that drawdown. That's 2029. And that's 5 years from now, where we could be the exact same level as where the market is right now. That's a scenario that I think is worth contemplating. Another question worth asking is, what's the zeitgeist for this decade, right? So there are 3 options. AI is an obvious one. I don't think it is because it's too close to the previous zeitgeist, but a lot of people would say it's AI. Health is another one, like GLP-1 drugs. So you want to be long Eli Lilly, for example. And the third is what I think is my best guess for it. And it's difficult to know these things in advance, but these are the 3 candidates that come to mind. The third candidate is climate, in my opinion. And that is important because it has implications for where to invest. Because climate is not a technological solution to climate, it's an industrial solution. You don't need venture capital, you need project finance. You don't need software, you need to build hard things. And that's not America's strength. And that means you may see an outperformance from other parts of the world. China is a superpower in the renewables market and leading the sort of energy transition in some ways from the critical supply chain standpoint. So China becomes super important. Contrary to the way it's performed in the last decade, it may outperform in the years to come. Materials have more needs than technological software, for example. And then if you think about the big tech companies, they're behaving a lot more like big oil companies because of their AI needs, their energy needs. They're now changing carbon accounting and postponing their climate targets. And so if this is the climate zeitgeist, then it's almost like anti-big tech, right? Another big theme is that we're entering post-pandemic, we're in this like pro-labor world as opposed to pro-capital. Meaning we were in this like 30-year period since the 1980s, since Reagan, where it was more about pro-capital. Policies that favored capital over labor. And I think since the pandemic, we have started this shift towards more pro-labor policies, which is raising taxes, extracting sort of rents from the winners, more antitrust, more focus on balancing the economy because inequality has reached levels that are dangerous. And if you apply that thinking to the election, if climate is a zeitgeist, then Trump isn't the president because Trump would reverse the climate agenda almost. Whether it's right or wrong is irrespective. It's more about the direction we're going. And a Kamala Harris win would be in support of that climate agenda. So if climate is the zeitgeist for this decade, if we're right in climate being the zeitgeist for this decade, that also supports a Democratic win. So and then if it's a pro-labor, that also supports a Democratic win because their policies that they're outlining are more pro-labor. They want to break up tech. They want to raise taxes. Again, right or wrong is not...
That is not the conversation.
Exactly.
Yeah. You're not on one side of the fence.
Yeah.
You're just presenting...
It's about being independent and just coming up with what are the best possible scenarios that we should look forward to and prepare for. And then the third thing I'd say is almost from a social standpoint, if America is an empire in decline, which I think a reasonable case can be made for that, whereby, there are 3 strikes from America, the way I look at it from a big geopolitical context, where we question America's supremacy. Strike 1 was in response to the 9/11 attacks, where they invaded Iraq against the UN. So they basically violated the rules-based order that they had built since the Second World War. And you suddenly realize, wait, so you can violate all these agreements and treaties and international rights don't matter? That was what gave rise to the strongmen, Putin, Xi in China, Orban back in the day, Erdogan. These are all strongmen from a political standpoint. That's what gave rise to strongmen because you realize that, sovereignty is no longer sacrosanct. The second strike was in the global financial crisis in 2008, when China realized you can't trust America for global economic management because the subprime crisis was a US creation that wrecked the global economy. So then they started prioritizing using their own currency and diversifying their reserves and trade agreements and settlements and whatnot. That was strike 2. And I think strike 3 was the Russian invasion of Ukraine, when in response, America seized the foreign reserves of Russia and sanctioned a lot of the oligarchs and elite, seizing property, seizing cash, bank balances and whatnot. You suddenly realize that, international property rights, which is what everybody relied upon, in America specifically, that can't be trusted, which led to the central bank buying of gold. For me, that was strike three in terms of like an empire in decline. Just think about it from a philosophical perspective. The vision for America was to expand its democracy and its policies across the world, bring more people into the fold of democracy, expand its borders, not like the imperial countries, but through its culture, through its success. And now the primary conversation in America is to restrict borders. It's like the reverse, right? Immigration is becoming a hot button issue. And if that is sort of the pathway of like an empire in decline, where your debt service costs are more than your defense spending, then I suspect the policies of the Democratic government will be aligned with that decline, where it's higher taxes, more social unrest, lack of. I'm not trying to predict the future, but what I'm saying is that given the policies that we can see between Trump and Harris, I think the Harris policies may create more sort of disturbance at a socio-economic level within the country, which supports the sort of an empire in decline. So these are some sort of non-conventional ways of approaching what's going on. I don't know what the polls are saying. I'm not following the polls. I'm not looking at every sort of state and looking at the odds. I'm not doing that. Again, I'm trying to be a thinking partner. So just creatively approach this, and then when you balance this with what the community is discussing and the feedback from the community and what they're seeing, we can potentially arrive at what may be a good picture of what's to come. That's the process.
Yeah, it gives you a pretty decent hypothesis of a potential future, or short-term future anyways, not long-term. So how does, because, and I won't get the language right, but with Ray Dalio, talks a lot about civil unrest. I forget the words. I don't think he uses those words. So, sorry, Ray, if you're listening. No. But where do you see America falling potentially, or what would be the influences that would lead to a greater unrest in the U.S. On civil discourse or inequality, from an economic standpoint? And
I think we're there. We saw remnants of it during the pandemic. There's lack of trust, extreme partisanship. You can see it in the surveys where it's very much party aligned, even how you feel about the economy. With AI, now you've got, zero marginal cost of producing content, which, to your point, creates more misinformation, disinformation. I don't think it's an American problem. I think it's a global problem where it's difficult to have a safe space for thoughtful conversation. Again, I think it's just lots of ideology, dogma that kicks in. So I think America is vulnerable, but so is every other country, perhaps.
I would say Canada, I think we're as bad, if not worse, as a candidate for that.
I agree. I think someone said to me that if the Democrats win, America could look like Canada 5 years from now. In terms of the policies at the macro level, because it's not been that great here.
Yeah. When I find, especially when I'm talking to people, when you talk about when the words like civil war, and those are strong, but get used, people can't think it's like they have this. What do you mean, like a civil war? Like what? Like we're gonna be rioting in the streets? Are we gonna be are people gonna be in line for food stamps, like in the Great Recession or the Great Depression? Sorry, is that to me that from a we've had so many decades of good times in general that people can't emotionally or psychologically connect themselves with that as a possibility.
I don't think about that much as a risk. Again, I'm thinking about everything from the lens of what it means for the markets. So I'm not trying to be a philosophical analyst, or I don't care much about themes that may not impact someone's portfolio, because I think that's where I want to direct my energy and attention. So I think what you bring up here is something that I've not paid attention to because I don't think it matters. What I think matters more is because I think what you're hinting at is perhaps like, what are some non-conventional ways things could get worse? What are some other risks, unknown risks? And I think what jumps to mind for me is either a geopolitical risk, an escalation in the Middle East, or perhaps a climate risk. And I think that the risk that is at the top of my mind, because there's a history of this, is a flooding in China, which would mean the disruption from the pandemic was nothing. I mean, China is the source of your global supply chain. And China has had the history of the 3 worst climate disasters over the last 125 years were in China. And they're all flooding related. So it's something that I pay attention to, is every season where you can have heavy rain, is to pay attention to what's happening specifically in China. So again, because it's a climate decade, right? I'm thinking a lot more in terms of just thematically, what are ways that we could see some disruption. So a climate risk is more important to me, I feel, than civil unrest or like a unforeseen geopolitical event that could sort of disrupt things.
Yeah. So with this happens, and then we have a ripple effect that creates, food shortages, supply shortages, et cetera, yeah. And then puts a deeper pressure on the psychology of the communities and the people of a nation or a continent. Basically. Interesting conversation, my friend. We have gone 2 hours, 20 minutes. Dude, this has been an awesome conversation. You're a beautiful soul, brother. Man, I just can't tell you like how much and I'm going to speak for my wife, because I know like we love you, brother. Like it's so great to have you here. This has been such an enriching conversation for me. I believe it will be the same for our listeners. Even just, it's almost like we had 2 conversations, this conversation about, philosophy and perspective and, your own path. But then the way you relay it to the markets is just so, it's just so unique. And I'm really grateful for the man that you are.
I appreciate that. And like I said to you, I'm here just to give you a hug. This conversation is just a bonus.
Yeah, dude, we had the best when you came. It was like, it's the best hug I've ever had. Appreciate it, man.
I love you.
Thank you for being here. I love you too. Thank you, guys. How do people find you?
On Twitter, it's at JSMIAN, or they could Google Stray Reflections book for the book, or stray-reflections.com for the investment community.
We'll put an Amazon link in the show notes for your book. Guys, go out and get that. You'll get a sense of what the book is by listening to this conversation. Jawad is an incredible human being. Check him out. If there's anybody out there that needs some perspective on their financial investments and they're managing their own portfolio, or they want some more insights, you can also see him at Stray Reflections. Thank you so much, brother. Appreciate you being here. Blessings to you and to your family too.
Thank you, Dwayne.
Okay.